Good morning and welcome once again to another very timely and very topical EMET webinar. In less than 2 weeks, on March 23rd, Israelis will be heading to the polls once again for the fourth election in 2 years. Why is this necessary? According to the polls, is this election likely to change the existing power structure within the Knesset? Who are the likely winners and who are the likely losers? What new alliances are being formed? Which demographic stands to gain from this election? And which, if any, stands to lose? Here to tell you about all of this and more is our good friend, Alex Traiman, Managing Director and Jerusalem Bureau Chief of JNS.org. Okay, so Alex, before we begin, how did we get to this place in the first place?
Okay, well, before I answer your question, I just want to thank you very much for having me and for all the work you're doing in Washington, D.C. You're really in the lion's den when it comes to defending the state of Israel and perhaps the most important house that can defend Israel outside of Israel, which is the Congress. So I just want to thank you so much for the work you're doing. It is greatly appreciated here, even if people don't get to see all the accomplishments on the day-to-day. Your efforts are felt here all the time. So thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Okay, so how did we get into this mess, right? We are now going to the fourth elections in a 2-year period. Now, in Israel, we have a very complex parliamentary system, right? Right now, we have 12 parties that look like they may enter into the next Knesset. So it's not a two-party system like in the United States. And the prime minister is not picked in a direct election. Rather, the largest party or one of the largest parties has to field a candidate, and then that candidate has to go ahead and to make a majority coalition among parties that were running against that person. So they have to come together as part of a coalition, and you need to get 61 out of the 120 seats together in order to make a majority. Now, what makes things even more complicated is that anywhere from 10 to 15 of those seats are Arab and self-proclaimed anti-Zionist parties that have historically never sat in any government, right or left, since the foundation of the state of Israel. So you basically have to collect 61 mandates out of, let's say, 105 if 15 of them go to the Arab party. So you really have to have like a sort of supermajority in order to form a coalition. So it's very complicated. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been one of the most successful prime ministers in the history of Israel, which is why he's been prime minister for 12 years straight and 15 years in total, is also a polarizing figure. And in particular, he has a hard time working with other politicians that have their eyes on his chair. And he's sort of a one-man show, and which has a lot of benefits because he's an incredible man, an incredible prime minister, but also has a lot of negatives to it because he has a hard time working with the people that need to be his political allies. So you had already about 2 years ago, Avigdor Lieberman, who had partnered many times with Benjamin Netanyahu, who represents the mostly Russian, which is usually considered a right-wing party and a natural ally of the Likud. They had worked together many times. They even ran together as a joint party in one of the elections. But he decided that it was time for Netanyahu's term as prime minister to end. And he understood that the only way to beat Netanyahu would be if the right implodes, because there's nobody from the left side of the spectrum that can gain enough popularity to take him out from the left. So the only way that you can actually take Netanyahu out is to break apart his right-wing base. And that threw Israel into an election cycle. And what happened was basically 3 consecutive elections where Netanyahu and his preferred partners, who are the national religious and also the ultra-religious parties, failed to cross that minimum 61 mandate threshold. So they were hovering close, 60 seats, 58 seats, and he couldn't form a government. However, the opposition similarly could not put together a 61-seat coalition because you're talking about parties on the right to parties on the left, including anti-Zionist Arab parties. So you have this hodgepodge of parties that the only thing that they have in common is that they don't want Netanyahu to be the prime minister. So because of that, they were unable to put together a coalition. Now, so we had in rapid fire 3 elections in barely 12 months time. And after this third election, things started to get very hectic, let's just say, in the political system. Now, things got hectic for a couple of reasons. First, the coronavirus pandemic was taking the world by storm, and it was clear that this was something totally out of the ordinary and required emergency mode thinking. Okay, so at the same time that we're now jockeying for a coalition, we now all of a sudden have this like massive international crisis. And we didn't know where it was going to go. So you've got this crisis and you've got another crisis on top of each other. Now, Benny Gantz, who basically ran as the chief opponent to Netanyahu in the 3 elections, as the head of this center-left blue and white alignment, it was called the Blue and White Party, basically had almost the same number of seats as the Likud in the 3rd election. And yet it was clear that neither Netanyahu nor Gantz could form a coalition. Then the Supreme Court actually got involved in a, I don't want to get too deep into it, but there was basically a sort of judicial overreach, which is common in Israel, where they basically, tried to alter the procedures, I would say, of the Knesset and how the Knesset speaker was picked. They actually did pull a fast one, and the Supreme Court ruled that Yuli Edelstein, who was the Speaker of the Knesset, had to hold a vote to replace himself prior to the forming of a coalition government, something which has never happened in the history. And the law is also very explicit that you don't have to name a new speaker until the coalition is formed. But basically, the left tried to work with the courts to do a parliamentary coup, essentially, to break the balance of power. And what they wanted to do was when they would change the Speaker of the Knesset, what they would do is introduce retroactive legislation barring Netanyahu from being the prime minister. That's what they tried to do. And it's now, it would have been a major crisis, except that Netanyahu, in his political acumen, figured out a way to break the Blue and White Party into half, sending Yair Lapid and his faction over to the opposition. And Benny Gantz took half of his Blue and White Party, essentially, and came into a unity government with Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, how did he convince him to do that? The way he convinced Benny Gantz, his opponent, who 3 times in a row said, I would never join a government with Netanyahu, and my whole purpose for running is to unseat Netanyahu. So why would he join a government with Netanyahu ultimately? Well, for 2 reasons. Number one, because there was this crisis now happening called coronavirus that desperately needed a government to be in place as opposed to a transitional government. And 2, Netanyahu gave him an offer that he couldn't refuse. And what was that offer? That he would actually yield the seat of prime minister to Benny Gantz in 2 years, that they created a rotation arrangement where Netanyahu would serve out the first almost 2 years of the term as the prime minister, and then halfway through would hand over the seat of power to Benny Gantz. And meanwhile, Benny Gantz came into the government as an alternate prime minister who had certain veto powers over government decisions, which also is unprecedented. And also the Blue and White Party got 15 of the ministries in an expanded cabinet of 36 ministers. So basically, the deal was very sweet. Gantz thought perhaps that he would become the prime minister in 2 years, and that the crisis of Corona and being unable to form a government after 3 inconclusive elections warranted somebody to take a bold step, and they made a unity government. Okay, now obviously this unity government was doomed to fail because of ideological differences. And sure enough, Netanyahu had figured out in this complex contract that was signed between the parties that he had a loophole. And the loophole Well, before we get to the, basically, when they made the contract, if Netanyahu would do anything to try to crash the government or to send elections, that would be an automatic trigger for Benny Gantz to become the prime minister. That was what they had negotiated. However, Netanyahu had a loophole, which was if the government failed to pass a budget, that would be a trigger for elections that would not make Benny Gantz the prime minister. So what Netanyahu actually did was he held up the budget, and Israel governed for the entire year of 2020 without a budget. And they moved the deadline a few times legislatively. They moved the deadline of the budget down to December of 2020. So basically, they'd already gone the whole year before they passed the budget for the year, and eventually a new election was triggered. Okay, now, so Netanyahu did not let Gantz become the prime minister, and in a sense, he actually did what the voting public of Israel wanted. And how do you see that? Because today, Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party is polling just at the minimum threshold, barely squeaking across with maybe 4 seats and possibly 5 seats and possibly no seats, because in the way the threshold works is if you don't get 4 seats, you don't get in. So it's a minimum 3.25% of the vote, 4 seats essentially. If you don't get 4, you get 0. So Gantz is polling barely above the threshold now. And today you have the Likud, and you have a similar situation to the three elections prior, which is Likud, which is polling right now around 30 seats, 28 to 30 seats, together with the ultra-religious parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, with another 15 seats. It's about 45 seats. The religious Zionist party, which is considered to the far right of the political spectrum, led by Bezalel Smotrich, they have another approximately 4 to 5 seats. It's about 50 seats between those parties. And then you have some parties that have emerged as alternative leadership parties to the right of the Likud, which are the EMET party led by Naftali Bennett. Right now, he's polling at about 10 seats. And also you have a new party, which is sort of a Likud defector party, which is the New Hope party, led by Gideon Sa'ar, who himself was a former minister of Likud. He also brought Zev Elkin, who was a former Likud minister, with him, and a few other Likud Knesset members like Sharon Haskell and others, to be an alternative. Now, when that party was formed a few months back, they were polling at about 20 seats. So they looked like a real formidable alternative. And you saw that Netanyahu now for the first time had a strong opponent to his right. However, in the last several weeks, the polls have shifted, and the New Hope party now is polling around 10 seats. The EMET also, which had previously been polling much higher, is now down to about 10 seats. And the center-left Yesh Atid party, which is run by Yair Lapid, has been surging over the last few weeks in the polls. They're currently sitting at about 20 seats. Now, Naftali Bennett has not ruled out sitting in the government with Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's believed by many that if he's the difference maker, if he's the one that bringing his seats into a Netanyahu-led coalition, that they would get over that hump of 61, that he would go in with Netanyahu, and he would probably be able to demand a king's ransom for being what we call the kingmaker in Israeli politics, which would be high-level positions for himself, probably the defense minister, and maybe a justice ministry portfolio for former Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, and maybe several other ministries. However, if they don't get above that 61 threshold, and right now the polls are really hovering very close, you might see Yesh Atid, led by Yair Lapid, plus the New Hope party led by Gideon Sa'ar, plus the EMET party led by Naftali Bennett, plus the left-wing Labor Party, plus potentially the far left-leaning Meretz party, plus potentially Benny Gantz's remaining blue and white faction come together and try to form an alternative government. So basically, we still don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
And it's definitely a threat that if nobody forms a government, that we might yet go to a fifth election.
Oh my gosh. All right. Okay. It's absolutely very hard for us in the United States to be able to conceive of living from election to election. And whatever happened to the budget? Was a budget finally passed?
No, a budget has not been passed. And basically what happens in a situation where the budget is not passed is that 2% increase in every ministry gets sort of automatically added. But as many countries have done during this coronavirus crisis, Israel has spent in deficit. Which is, it's a risk, of course, but it's a risk that other nations have been taking. Fortunately, the major credit agencies have maintained Israel's credit status despite the deficit spending. So it seems like we're doing pretty well in that respect. And hopefully a budget will be passed soon for 2021.
Right, right. And in the private sector, the economy is soaring despite all that.
Well, I would say just on that you have the brains of the Israeli economy, which is the high tech and the R&D, and that's doing very well despite what's been happening. However, the heart of the Israeli economy is the small business owner, and the small businesses have gotten hit very, very hard because Israel has had, perhaps, I've read, the most lockdowns of any country in terms of retail commerce and things like that, and tourism obviously has been shuttered for a year. So there's a lot of damage that's taken place to the heart of the economy.
Right. As throughout the world, it's the small business owner that really has suffered. So I've been hearing a lot about some new Arab parties, like the Ma'an party, who's willing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu was willing to form a coalition with some of the Arab parties. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. Okay, so I mentioned that in the last election that this joint Arab list, which is a conglomeration of Arab parties that themselves are not necessarily ideologically aligned. One is more communist, one is you have this alignment. So one of the things that Netanyahu succeeded in doing was actually breaking this joint list of four parties. He siphoned off one of the parties to run independently. This is the Ra'am party. And it's led by Mansour Abbas, who is believed to be an ally, so to speak, of Benjamin Netanyahu. According to, I would say, most of the polls, they may not cross the threshold. According to some of the polls, they may get the 4 seats. Either way, this is a victory for Netanyahu, because if he does cross the threshold, that perhaps he would, from outside a coalition, support a minority government led by Netanyahu. That's a possibility. But if he does not cross the threshold, what happens is those votes, the people that voted for him, those votes get redistributed across the entire spectrum. And so what that means is that the remaining joint list is polling at about 9 seats right now, which is 6 seats less than the Arab parties got just a year ago. And if you have, if you would get 9 seats as opposed to 15, that would add 6 seats into the pool of Zionist parties that want to form a coalition government. So, that would make you need 61 out of, let's say, 111 instead of out of 105. So that makes the math a lot easier.
Right. All right. So now I'm going to hand the podium over to our very, very capable Benjamin Whale, who is
right now that I've confused everybody.
Now that we're so confused, right, and doing the math in our head simultaneously. The important number is 61. That's all you have to know. It's 61 votes to be able to maintain a majority, really. So Benjamin Whale is our director of EMET's program for Israel's national security, a really wonderful rising star within EMET, and we're very delighted to have him. And Benjamin will be reading the questions that have come in. Benjamin?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Alex, for your introduction and words. And we've got a number of questions that came in and I'll ask them as we get them, and hopefully we'll be able to answer all the questions. The first question is, what are the chances that this election will not lead to a new government and that Israel will face a fifth election round?
Yeah, so I think the chances of that are very reasonable. It's hard to know exactly, right? As I had mentioned, the parties that you would call the preferred parties of Netanyahu, the ones that have a few of the parties, the religious parties, have already pledged that they will not negotiate a coalition without Netanyahu. The religious Zionist party to the far right of the spectrum with its 5 seats has a vote sharing agreement with the Likud party, and it's believed that they would recommend Netanyahu for the prime minister. The only ambiguous party here for the time being seems to be the EMET party, which has not ruled out sitting with Netanyahu and believe they would, but have not committed to that. But basically all the other parties, the New Hope party, the Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party, the Yesh Atid party led by Yair Lapid, Labor, Blue and White, they've all basically committed to not sitting with Benjamin Netanyahu, almost under any circumstances. So the chances that you're going to have a deadlock are still very, very good. And it's going to depend on election day if the preferred parties will scrape across that line. If they do, you might see a small right-wing government of 61 or 62 seats. But at the same time, if they do, then other parties might say, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And then you might actually get a larger government because, you know, there's more to gain from going into that government than from sitting in the opposition.
Benjamin?
Yes, and the next question is, Bennett, Saar, and Lapid all claim to form a government with the other two parties sitting in their coalition. Does this mean that if the three of them form a coalition, that we will have a three-way rotation?
Right. So obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu opened up a bit of a Pandora's box after the third election with this concept of a rotation arrangement. Now, what I don't think anybody is voting for in Israel is a three-headed rotational monster in which Yair Lapid, Gideon Sa'ar, and Naftali Bennett would all be alternating the post of prime minister every 12 to 16 months or whatever that math works out to be. So then the question is, who would become the prime minister, or which of the candidates would be the most likely to sit in a rotation or be first? Now, the way it works right now, the way it looks in the polls is that Yair Lapid has about 20 seats. So he's kind of emerged in the last 2 weeks, moving up from about 14, 15 seats to about 20, while the other parties led by Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett have moved down in the polls to hovering around 10 seats. So that puts Lapid at a very clear advantage. And Netanyahu has also used that to his advantage because he is saying one of his major campaign talking points is that if you're voting for Sa'ar or if you're voting for Bennett, it means that you're voting for Lapid to be the prime minister. And that's exactly where Netanyahu wants this race to be, because Lapid is more of an ideological opponent, while Sa'ar and Bennett are both running against Netanyahu more on personality issues than on ideology. So the likelihood in terms of the math would be that Lapid would be the prime minister. However, Naftali Bennett has made a pledge that he would not sit in a government under Yair Lapid, right? And the reason why he's doing that is to enhance his own leverage, that perhaps if Netanyahu cannot form a government of 61, that the other parties are now going to have to negotiate among themselves and pick either Lapid or Sa'ar or Bennett or some rotation of 2 or 3 of them. And Bennett is kind of hoping to shoot the moon, so to speak, and be the one that comes out of the pack. That's the one that can unite the other parties together under his leadership. However, you'd be in a position where somebody that has 10 seats out of 120, less than 10% of the overall vote, is trying to vie to be the prime minister of Israel. And that is a position that doesn't really match what the voters want.
Thank you. Is Bennett in the position to make a similar deal with Bibi that Gantz did?
Well, Bennett is saying that that he may join, that he would potentially join a government. So that in a sense brings his leverage down a little bit. Netanyahu has said there will be no rotations in this negotiation. So you have to. I think that it would be likely that Bennett, in such, if he does become the kingmaker for Netanyahu, that he would likely be either the foreign minister or the defense minister. But I don't think there would be any rotation between Netanyahu and Bennett. However, anything goes at this point.
And then what is the likelihood of the ultra-Orthodox bloc or parties to sit in a Bennett-Saar government?
I think that there is potentially a chance of that. However, it wouldn't happen at first because the religious parties are loyal to Netanyahu. Like Aryeh Deri, the head of the Shas party, said, in an interview this week that he doesn't see anybody leading the country aside from Netanyahu. And so they will try to put their support behind Netanyahu. Now, if that fails, and if there seems to be no other option, and somehow or another Gideon Sa'ar or Naftali Bennett would yield enough political capital together to make something possible, I wouldn't rule it out. On ideological grounds, you can't rule out a government. The the religious parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties, are not ideologically opposed to sitting with Sa'ar or Bennett. Now, that is a little bit different than Avigdor Lieberman and Yair Lapid, who have campaigned heavily with this anti-Haredi, anti-religious campaign. So that makes it more difficult for them to sit together in a government. But again, what you're bringing up is the fact that what's important to understand that the election is not necessarily won on the night of the election. It's a very important point that the election is won when one candidate or one party can form a coalition. And so there will be intense negotiations from the moment the exit polls come out to see who can first put together a majority coalition.
What are the basic, sorry?
How long do these negotiations last before there's a functioning government?
It's a very good question. So what happens is the day after the final tally comes in, because it does actually take time, we count the ballots by hand here, and it will take several days. And now also the election is right on the eve of Passover. It's just a few days before Passover. So it might take several days before the final tallies. From the moment you have the final tallies and they're delivered to the president will then invite the head of every party to his residence for a recommendation on who they want to be the prime minister. And the candidate that has the most recommendations will be given the first opportunity to try to form a government. And he'll have 28 days to try to form a majority coalition. If at the end of 28 days he fails to form a coalition, the president then can appoint another Knesset member the opportunity to have 21 days in order to form a government. If the second candidate doesn't, then that opens up a period of, I think it's 21 days also, in which any member of the Knesset can come with a petition with 61 signatures to the president, and then the president would give that person another 2 weeks to try to form a government. And if at that time, once you've gone through basically 3 mandates to form a government, if nobody is able to do it, then the Knesset will be disbanded and you will go to yet a 5th election. And I would say that that was impossible, except that it's already happened 2 times. So.
Thank you. And what are the basic issues in this election? What are the Israeli voters' most pressing concerns?
So again, I think the most pressing concerns are the handling of the coronavirus crisis. People here really want to get back to normal, and they want to be healthy on the one, and they also want to make sure that the economy opens up and that they're able to live their lives normally. So that's really issue number 1. I think the economic and health are 1 and 2 to the Israeli voters. But we also see the political winds changing in the United States. We see that we no longer have a very, very staunch ally in the White House like we did before in Donald Trump, who worked very well and very closely with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And in a sense, we almost have a potentially adversarial relationship with the new administration, because the Biden team has appointed several of the negotiators and authors of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, into key positions. Also, it's believed that the Biden administration will try to make the issue of the Palestinian conflict a primary issue in its relations with Israel. And I can tell you very clearly that Israelis from right to left are not thinking about the Palestinian issue at all. There's nobody across the spectrum from the right to the center left that wants to change the status quo right now with the Palestinians. However, it's believed that the Biden administration may start pressuring Israel to re-engage with the Palestinians, really against our will. So we have these looming diplomatic and security crises that are sort of hanging over our heads. If the Biden administration will rush in and sign a new nuclear deal, there's a question of, does that make a open conflict with Iran more likely? You know, if you look at what's been happening over the last several years, Israel is fighting an asymmetric war with Iran already, in which we are attacking Iranian installations in Syria and elsewhere. And in fact, even inside Iran itself, there's been explosions at Iran nuclear facilities. There's been assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, and we don't know specifically that they were performed by Israeli intelligence, but we have good reason to assume that that's a possibility. And even now, whoever's reading the news of the last few weeks will know that the entire shoreline of Israel has been tarred in an oil spill, and the details regarding that spill are under gag order, and it's already been reported that it could potentially be. In fact, the environmental minister said that she believes that this is environmental terrorism, and that this ship was a ship that had Iranian oil in it that was docked in Libya and was going towards Syria. And we're not sure if that was intentionally leaked or accidentally leaked, but the entire shoreline of Israel has just been tarred with poisonous oil from top to bottom of the country. So, you know, there's the threat of a much larger military engagement with the Iranians, and we can't discount the fact that there are approximately 150,000 missiles pointed at Israel in southern Lebanon. So, you know, one of the key things that Netanyahu has been trying to been campaigning on is, you know, who's going to make the decisions to keep Israel safe. You know, that it's Netanyahu that's been, you know, ordering each and every operation, you know, as part of this asymmetric war. And can you imagine somebody like Yair Lapid making those decisions, or even somebody like Gideon Sa'ar, who's never made such decisions before, or Naftali Bennett, who's never made such decisions before? And will that prime minister be able to stand up to Joe Biden if the administration starts to make moves that we believe are against Israeli security interests?
And I think it is somewhat interesting that in previous election campaigns, whether it was in the last year or two or even further in the past, when Netanyahu would emphasize the Iranian threat, his contestants or adversaries would point out that Netanyahu is trying to blow this small little threat into something much larger, and that he's exaggerating. And in this election campaign, you don't hear the left or even his opponents on the right really downplaying that threat. And I think it's somewhat interesting. Maybe they've come to a realization, or they're trying to emphasize other key issues that they're running on right now in this election.
You know, I want to touch on this point that you're making here because it's very important. Netanyahu famously went to the Congress in 2015 and gave a highly controversial speech to the joint sessions of the Congress against the signing of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Now, at the time, Yair Lapid and others on the left highly criticized that move, because that move did, in fact, anger the Obama administration to a great deal. And not only just President Obama, but also much of the Democratic Party was angered that Netanyahu would dare to make such a controversial move. And they said, the opponents in Israel, like Yair Lapid, said that such a move risks the bipartisan support that Israel has in the Congress, and also angers American Jewry and makes them want to support Israel less. At the same time, that was a pivotal moment in Israel's history, because what it did was let the other nations in this Middle East know that Israel was taking the Iranian threat seriously, and that Israel would go to all ends, including angering the president of the United States, to put Israeli and also regional interests above potentially the relationship with America. And in fact, we have now signed normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain. The Prime Minister of Israel was potentially about to meet the Saudi Crown Prince this week. His trip is now canceled. It's another issue, but hopefully we'll meet him soon. So the winds of peace are changing in the Middle East because of the move that Netanyahu made. Now, if Yair Lapid was the prime minister, would he cozy up to President Biden as such that if Biden wanted to go back into the JCPOA, that he would not stand against that? Or would he stand against that? That's a big question that I think the Israeli voter has to understand when they go to the voting booth.
And I think another issue is that Naftali Bennett, in the past, he always ran on that ticket of Mr. Defense and Foreign Affairs, which is probably Netanyahu's playing field. He's a master at that. He always emphasizes the peace deals, about Iran, all these external threats, or even bringing vaccines from around the world. And I think something that Bennett realizes that Netanyahu's weak spot is his internal affairs or domestic policy. And he's seen his Ayelet Shaked, his number two, be so successful as Minister of Defense. And now he's highlighting bringing the Israeli economy back on its feet and helping out small businesses and the economy. And I think that he's also realized that his strength lays in other places, and that may increase, maybe not bring him to a position to become prime minister, but will help him get a little more support and seats in parliament.
Even opponents of the prime minister recognize that he has, by and large, kept Israel safe. You know, hasn't rushed Israel into wars. He's tried to keep conflict management, conflicts down to a minimum through smart conflict management. So in terms of defense credentials, you can't beat Netanyahu, who's been the prime minister now for 15 years. You know, he knows how to keep the country safe, and people understand that. When it comes to diplomacy, everybody understands that Netanyahu is one of the world's top diplomats. He can sit face to face in a meeting with the president of the United States, and he can sit face to face in a meeting with Vladimir Putin or with Angela Merkel or anybody else and not be intimidated. Everybody recognizes that. Where Naftali Bennett made early gains in this campaign was attacking Netanyahu on the coronavirus management, which is an issue that's been held dear by many Israelis, because we've been under lockdown. The retail has been closed, the schools have been closed, the airport's been closed. Israelis haven't been able to fly anywhere almost in the last year. So Bennett has been challenging Netanyahu on his management of the coronavirus crisis, and where Netanyahu turned that around was in his ability to close the deal with Pfizer in order to bring the vaccines in that would be able to inoculate the entire population of the country, something that no other country has been able to do. Perhaps we're able to do it because of our small size, but perhaps we were also able to do it because of Netanyahu's diplomatic acumen. So once the vaccine started to come in, and Netanyahu has been campaigning very heavily that the way to exit coronavirus is only through the vaccine. And Israelis have bought into that. And most Israelis have chose to vaccinate and hope that Netanyahu is right. And because of that success in bringing the vaccines into the country, Bennett's popularity, which had been at close to 20 seats before Saar had entered the race, is now down to about 10.
And if Gantz gets past the threshold and no government is formed, would he default into the position of prime minister at the end of the year?
Okay, it's a good question, and it's a question that is probably going to require legal review. However, according to the current rotation arrangement, Gantz would have taken over as the prime minister in November of 2021. So if you total up the 1 month plus 2 months, the 2.5 months basically that different candidates have an opportunity to negotiate a coalition, you would probably trigger a fifth election before November 2021 in any case. So the chance that he would become the prime minister before a fifth election, I think is very slim, just in terms of the timing. But there's another question which comes out, which is, what if Benny Gantz, his party, does not cross the threshold and he's no longer a member of Knesset? Okay, then can he be fired as a minister in Netanyahu's government? Because firing Benny Gantz is a trigger to make Gantz the prime minister. So in lieu of another government being formed, does the previous arrangement still hold? These are legal questions, and the Attorney General has yet to give a legal opinion on the matter. He's saying that he's not going to give an opinion on what is purely a speculative or theoretical situation. But if those things happen, yeah, then the Attorney General will have to get involved, and then the Supreme Court might have to get involved, and that will be a very, very ugly situation. But we've seen that the court is happy to create an ugly political situation, as we saw after the third election. So these are the hypotheticals and the complications of the system. And the natural question is, well, is your system a good system? Yeah, and that there's good reasons to argue that the system itself is an unstable system, and yet I've heard other people argue that the American system, which seemed to be a much more stable system, is today also doesn't seem as stable as it once was. So, basically what I would say is that democracy has not been putting its best foot forward, neither in the United States nor in Israel over the past 2 years.
How much emphasis has Netanyahu put into getting Arab votes, and how many Likud mandates is Netanyahu expecting to get from the Arab population?
Right. Netanyahu is actually taking considerable efforts in the last several months to try to court Arab votes, and there's the belief that many Arabs, they understand who's strong and who's weak, and they recognize that Netanyahu is not only the strongest player in the field, but also that he's turned Israel into the strongest player in the region, and that Israel under his watch has become an economic and a military superpower, and that he's brought peace with other Arab nations, and that these bring natural economic opportunities, especially to the Arab sectors in Israel, that have yet to materialize just because everything is so fresh and the airports have been closed. But it's highly likely that these normalization agreements will bring economic opportunities also for Arabs. And so they see that their lives have improved economically and could continue to improve economically under Netanyahu's continued rule. So more of them are considering voting for Netanyahu. How many? It's hard to predict. We might not know, but for Netanyahu, for him, a swing of one seat, from a new pool of voters that hadn't voted for him in the past, could be enough to give him what he needs in order to form a preferred coalition.
And what, if any, role is the recent decision of the Supreme Court on conversions playing in this election?
So some people are arguing that it gives more fuel to the religious parties to come out and vote and to try to make sure that there's a right-wing government in place. But realistically, I would say it plays very little impact. The number of people that are converting through reform or conservative movements in Israel is you can count it in the dozens of people. We're not talking about thousands of people. And I think that Netanyahu said this week something which I think is very important. He said, listen, for people that authentically want to convert to Judaism, through whichever stream of Judaism speaks to them most, that's not the concern. There's not really an issue there, and we can figure out how to deal with that. What's more of an issue is if you have like a migration from Africa or something like that, or people that just want to be part of the Israeli project, don't care much about Judaism and go through this, through a cheap man's version of a conversion process, that's the threat. But I think what's more important is that you see now that the court once again wants to get involved in issues where maybe the Supreme Court shouldn't get involved. I mean, these are religious issues, and the question is, should a Supreme Court, which is not a religious body, be involved in religious decisions? Just like you had the case, about a year ago, where should the court determine the protocols of the legislature? Is that a violation of the checks and balances that are supposed to exist between the three branches of government? And so the issue of judicial reform is an important issue to the right-wing parties, who have seen a mostly left-wing court overreach its boundaries and be a self-proclaimed activist court where it can decide on its own that legislation is illegal because it decided. It can decide that the legislature needs to pass a law on a certain issue that because it decided. It can hear cases where the plaintiffs have no standing in the case, which is unlike in the United States. So, there are a number of different reasons why right-wing parties suggest that the court needs to be reformed. And that is one of the major issues that's at stake here, as to whether or not Netanyahu can form a natural right-wing government. If he can, then you will see the government try to enact some degree of judicial reform. However, if Netanyahu has to form a government with parties that he does not prefer to form a government with, then that basically puts the issue of judicial reform and other issues that are important to the right wing on hold. And unfortunately for Netanyahu, he's had to govern for much of his premiership, extended premiership, without the parties in government that he wants, and with Benny Gantz himself saying, "I'm the check. I'm the opposition within the government. I'm the one to hold Netanyahu at bay." And Netanyahu's actually had to govern that way, for a long time. So he's definitely hoping that he can make a right-wing government once and for all to put forward the platform that he wants to put forward, which includes judicial reform.
Thank you. And earlier we had discussed the Israeli economy. What is the cost of this fourth election, and how damaging is it to Israel's matzav? This is in quotation marks. And what are the economic and social costs of another election?
Right. So first is the costs of elections themselves. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we're talking about the four elections is at least hundreds of millions of shekels just in elections, because the parties get money to run elections, and there's all sorts of costs, and there's even more costs now with this election because special voting arrangements have to be set up for coronavirus. So it's very costly itself to go to elections. A greater cost is in being unable to pass a budget, right? So you're not able to move monies from one ministry to another, so there's those costs. And then you're right that there's also the social costs, which is the last thing that Israel needs is to go down this rabbit hole, I would say, that the United States went down, where you have this like highly polarized and intense, very tense, election atmosphere. And we've had to go through it now. We're going through the fourth time. I will say that this campaign, unlike the third one, especially, has really been subdued, by many. That it's not getting the same type of energy because there is this election fatigue. I think the only thing that would enhance election fatigue would be a fifth election. So we're certainly hoping that we don't have to do that again. It's not good for the country. It's much better to have a stable political system, especially when you have so many threats to stability from outside, the security threats and the global economic threats and the diplomatic threats.
Has there been a decline in the voter outturn in the recent elections, or is there a fear of that happening?
It's been pretty steady across the three elections. I think there's always the risk of that. We'll just have to wait and see. But I do think that Israelis see it as their responsibility to, to put a stable government into place. And I think that they take it seriously. Election day here is a national holiday. So there's not really too much excuse for Israelis not to go out and vote. It takes only a couple of minutes. And, I know that we are the startup nation, and Netanyahu has recently called us the vaccination nation, but maybe we're also the election nation. So Israelis are going to go out and vote as long as it takes to make a government.
Then one of our audience members points out that he knows that this had been done in the past, but is there finally a serious move to having the direct election of the prime minister in Israel, or is this something that is pretty much abandoned and part of the past?
Right. It's a good question. Netanyahu actually became prime minister the first time in 1996 in a direct election for prime minister. He narrowly defeated Shimon Peres by about 30,000 votes. The difficulty with having a direct election for prime minister, even though it makes sense on a lot of levels, is that you still have a parliamentary system, okay, where people are voting for parties, and then you have to form a government. And the problem there, if you elect the prime minister, then what happens is that individuals will vote first for the person that they want to be the prime minister, and then they will vote for the party that they're most ideologically aligned with. And what happens is that favors the small parties on the sides of the spectrums, and then the smaller parties become larger, and then the ruling parties become smaller. And then the ruling parties have less leverage to govern because they don't have those amount of seats, right? So it was Netanyahu himself that got hurt by the direct election because he didn't have enough leverage to govern from the position of being by far and away the largest party in the government. And so that's why you still have this, they shifted out of the direct election for prime minister system. But you're asking another question, which at the same time, which is this a stable system? Which the answer is probably not. And what changes could be made? And unfortunately, it would take a very, very strong government to be able to make the changes necessary to stabilize the system. So if you do not form a very strong government, you won't have the political capital to change the system. And yet at the same time, if you have the political capital to form a very strong government in the current system, do you have the motivation to want to change the system? Right. So it's this conundrum here. And there is a feeling that wouldn't it be better if you simply voted for the prime minister directly on the one, and then on the other, if you would have regional representation in the parliament, which you do not have, and which has a number of difficulties. Israel's a democracy, but most of the parties that are running for the Knesset don't have primaries. And so let's say, for example, the Yesh Atid party, which is polling at 20 seats, people will vote for them because they want Yair Lapid to be the prime minister. But that doesn't mean that they get to choose who's number 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 20 on that list. It's kind of like you're voting for the party, and the party can pick its list however it wants. And as such, you cannot unelect bad parliamentarians. You can't get bad parliamentarians out of office. So there's a lot of challenges of the parliamentary system, but at this point also there's not really any chances on the horizon for changing the way it works or for formalizing a constitution. I mean, we're a country that doesn't have a constitution. The system that we have was put in place by a number of precedents that get set. Like, okay, you're a new country. It's 1948. You're a brand new country. What do? Well, okay, this time, because we're new and we don't have time, we're gonna create the government like this. And then it's time for the next election. You say, well, what are we gonna do now? and they say, well, we should change it, but I don't know if we can, so let's just do it the way we did it last time. And then what you have is grandfathered system, but currently there's not really too many ideas, with the exception of one, which is to really raise the threshold, which would make it such that let's say you need to get 10% of the vote in order to get into the government. And what that does is it takes away the leverage of these smaller parties. You'd see small parties go together. So you would maybe have larger parties, where you don't have like 6 different parties that are potential kingmakers or coalition breakers, sitting on the fringes of the Israeli political spectrum.
As you mentioned right now and described at the beginning, that in Israel, you're not voting for a prime minister, you're voting for a political party, which is why it's interesting that Netanyahu, Sa'ar, Bennett, Lapid in the past, and even somewhat now are all claiming that they're running for premiership, when in fact, that's false. People are voting for a party, and that hasn't even stopped Netanyahu from adopting a tactic where basically ignoring Bennett and Sa'ar and telling the Israeli population that it's between me and Lapid, when in reality, Netanyahu himself has proven in the past, you don't have to be the largest party to even become the prime minister. When he ran against Tzipi Livni, even though he was the second largest party, he still was the one to form the coalition and ultimately become the prime minister. So it's very interesting. And we have, I think, time for one last question. It's about Netanyahu's legal I guess, situation. And the question is, what is the status of Netanyahu's lawsuits, and how does that affect this election or any future election?
Well, the trials have basically already commenced. Well, you have the pre-trials hearings have already begun. So the cases are, going to be held in the court. And I think several weeks after the election, you'll have the next hearing. I think Israelis have already had 3 opportunities to weigh Netanyahu's corruption charges when they go to the voting booth. And I don't think at this point that the charges themselves or the cases are affecting votes in a way that they haven't already affected them in the last 3 elections. You have two camps on this. One camp is Netanyahu is corrupt, and he's guilty of not just what he's being charged, but guilty of a lot. And it's time for him to go. It's time for anybody who's been the prime minister for 12 years straight to be out of office. We need term limits. So that's the argument of the left and of the opponents of Netanyahu. Some of them are on the right. And then you have those that recognize that the charges being brought against Netanyahu are unprecedented charges, not only in Israel, but unprecedented in any democracy in the world, in which he's being charged of receiving favorable media coverage as a bribe, which on the one, you can't really see any evidence of favorable media coverage. And at the same time, you have precedent court cases in the United States and England and Australia where there's been clear rulings that receiving positive media coverage cannot be considered a bribe, because it is the job of the prime minister to try to gain the best possible coverage. And there's been multiple precedents of quid pro quos between major media moguls and presidents and prime ministers of countries, and they have never in any cases been charged either side with a bribe, because also that is an infringement on free press. And if you start to charge a media company for giving favorable coverage to a politician, that's a slippery slope that puts limits on free speech. And so you have much of the Israeli public which sees these cases as being an attempt to remove Netanyahu from office where the voters can't. The best way to summarize it is that the opponents of Netanyahu want to get him out by hook or by crook. And since hook has not worked, that they're trying by crook.
All right. So thank you once again, Alex Traiman, for your incredibly comprehensive, incredibly clear, and incredibly concise explanation of how we got to this place and what is going on in this current election. I've often said that the greatest gain I have ever received from my years and years of political activism is the friendships that I've managed to garner along the way. And I can't thank you enough for your years of solidarity and support and friendship, let alone your erudition, Alex Traiman.
Thank you,
so much.
Sarah. Thank you. The feeling is certainly mutual. And just to answer the last question, which nobody asked, which is what do I think is going to happen, is I would say don't bet against Netanyahu. He's by far the strongest player in the field. He was able to break the blue and white party in half after 3 consecutive elections. And I think it's likely that he will make this whatever needs to happen to form a government. And if he can't, I don't really see any way in which any of the other parties will be able to form an alternative coalition.
Right. It is very, very hard to read the tea leaves, especially when looking at the Middle East and Israel's political structure. But I think if anybody can, it is you, Alex Traiman. So thank you so much. All right.
Let's put in a plug also for JNS.
Yes, and please, JNS is probably the best thing that's happened to worldwide Jewry since Moses led us out of Egypt. with Pesach coming up, Passover coming up.
I wouldn't say that it's anything close to that, but I would humbly suggest that we're the highest quality source of news in the Jewish world.
Very, very, very high quality source of news, and it is incredibly dependable. They have their finger on the pulse of everything, and we are very, very grateful. It's also an alternative to the lock that a lot of the Jewish newspapers had been under by the left, and it's very refreshing to see some other points of view, and it's really, really encouraging to see how it has taken off and run so beautifully within the last 2 years since it's come about. So, kala kavod to you, Alex, and to everyone who's in the leadership of.
So go to jns.org and sign up for a daily newsletter.
Please, go to jns.org and sign up. And if you can have the wherewithal, please support jns.org. I also would like to tell everybody to be sure to tune in next Wednesday, March 17th, where we are going to be having another very special guest, His Excellency Ali Rashid Al-Nuami, who's a chairman of the Hadaya Center. And this is the International Center for Fighting Violent Extremism. And he is also a member of the United Arab Emirates and of the Federal National Council, representing the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. And he is chairman of the Council of the Defense Affairs, Interior, and Foreign Affairs Committee. Now, this is very important because the question that he is going to be answered in is whether or not the strength of the Abraham Accords is strong enough to withstand the vicissitudes coming out of any Western power or any White House. And I really would like to just encourage everybody to tune in because he is a very, very special individual. He has his PhD in philosophy. He's a very, very strong thinker, and he, I think, is representing the new wave of intellectuals in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia that really appreciate that Israel is here to stay. And despite, what other influences might want to play up or play down as being important, he seems to really believe, or that's the question, but I assume that he seems to believe that the strength of the friendship and of Israel's superior military might and is blossoming between Israel and the Gulf nations. So this is going to be very, very exciting. And please, if you can, support jns.org. And I do have to say that all of this costs a great deal of money, and we do believe that a well-informed citizenry does trickle down to a well-informed electorate. And so we feel that this is all being brought to you as a public service. So if you can also go to emetonline.org and try to support our organization. But first, support Alex Traiman and jns.org. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll be signing